Good afternoon. I'm Doug Stewart with the Society of Aviation and Flight Educators here at Sun and Fun 2019. And with me are my real good friends Mike Garrison and Bill Ziesenitz. The three of us are examiners, designated pilot examiners. We're going to talk a little bit today about some of the problems we see with practical tests that we conduct as initial CFI practical tests. So Mike, why don't you start off? What's your worst one that you see?
Well, I think some of the very basic things that I see far too often are candidates that come for a test and they aren't prepared. I've had people show up without a knowledge test. I've had people show up without an 8710 application completed. This is pretty elementary. You shouldn't even send somebody to an examiner without these basics. Probably more important, I'm finding some very basic things such as the use of GPS. When you dig a little deeper, that the instructor doesn't have those skills himself and thus has not prepared the candidate. Bill?
Yes, one of the things that I find important is just the fundamentals, whether it's a flight instructor or a private pilot candidate, but most importantly, initial flight instructor candidates. I think it's very important that they understand fundamentals, and that means the kinds of things you were talking about. These are the things that you expect to have when you're doing a flight test, practical test. But also the aerodynamic issues. You talk about all the different factors affecting an airplane, and you find so many initial instructor applicants that don't really understand a lot of that sort of thing. And the problem is, as you said, when you see a problem with a student, it's usually the instructor that either didn't understand or didn't do his job properly. So I think it's so important to build that foundation of knowledge, and the instructor is the kingpin of the whole operation. If you don't do that right, it's not going to go well from there on.
It seems to me that many of them come and they are not prepared, but even the tools that they're using to prepare. An example, left turning tendencies. We could probably ask half the people walking down this aisle here where the left turning tendencies come from. They could probably tell us. But I actually had a flight instructor, initial applicant, tell me he was trying to describe P factor and said because the descending blade went faster as it went down than the ascending blade.
That was a problem.
And I scratched my head and I said, well, it is kind of all forged out of one piece of metal. How does this happen? Where did you learn this? And his answer, YouTube.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh.
And he's not the first person that I've seen that way. And I've asked, have you read the Airplane Flying Handbook? The what? The Airplane Flying Handbook? I suggest you read it. So I certainly see lack of preparation or poor preparation with the wrong tools.
I think a lot of instructors don't realize that whether it's a PTS or ACS, that in there you have a lot of reference material, a lot of guidance as to how the test is conducted, what the expected, what the acceptable parameters are. And in each of the tasks, you have a reference. It could be the flying handbook or whatever is appropriate. And I don't think many of the instructors realize that they need to go back and refresh themselves on what the reference is, because I'll have people that say, disagree about how something's supposed to be done. I said, well, sure, let me just pull up my iPad and we'll look at the flying handbook and see it says right here. And they don't even understand, they don't realize that that's where things come from.
Right.
When you mentioned the Airman Certification Standards, the ACS, a very weak area I'm seeing is the risk management. That was a new element that was actually put into the standards. And when I have people tell me that proficiency and currency is the same thing, they clearly don't understand. Those are distinctly two very different things. And that's just one of a whole lot. But I'm finding that the instructors are not preparing people in that risk management area. It's very, very weak on most of the tests that I see.
I agree. They're missing it completely. I'll quite often ask the applicant, and this is the CFI Initial again. I ask any applicant, whether it's private, instrument, or commercial, I said, we have basically 4 buckets of risk that we have to manage as pilots flying airplanes, whether it's once around the pattern or once around the world. What are those buckets? And they stare at me. And I'll ask, well, have you heard the PAVE acronym? And sometimes they'll say, oh yeah, I heard it. Now, when I started with them, I'll ask, have you read the ACSs? You're testing to a PTS as a CFI, but you have to teach to the ACS. Do you know how many times the word PAVE, the acronym PAVE, appears in the ACS? deer in the headlights. And it's there 8 times by my count. I might have missed a couple. And yet I see that, just as you say, Mike, they're not teaching risk management. Now, we certainly have major problems, that there's a lack of stick and rudder skills, but there's also, the ACS has been out now, what, 2-3 years, I think, for the private. By this point, we think that instructors are learning to teach about risk management.
How do you think instructors should work in risk management into their training? I find a lot of people just go by the nuts and bolts. You know, here's step 1, 2, 3, 4, and you learn all the nuts and bolts of the process or the maneuver or whatever it is. But it doesn't seem like they go beyond that and get into these other elements like the risk management, which is so important.
Proficiency applies to everything you do, whether it's a maneuver. The planning proficiency is pretty basic to flying.
Absolutely. I discussed with them what tools can they give a learner to help them manage risks. And what I'm looking for is some mention of personal minimums or a flight risk assessment tool. But when I ask them, how do you teach a learner how to objectify these things? They're lost. And it's because they've never gotten it in their own training.
I think it's important that from students, really from almost day one, need to get into the risk management mindset. And they need to be thinking about, maybe they'll make a wrong decision, but they do it under the tutelage of their instructor, and they learn by doing. And maybe it's they have weather minimums or whatever it may be, and based on that they can make a decision. And the student may feel that they can go ahead and take the flight, but then the instructor will say, well, yes, but you didn't consider this, and that way it's another step in the learning process that a lot of times doesn't happen. So I think instructors are so focused on just teaching that particular maneuver or task or whatever it is, they kind of lose sight of the rest of it.
Going in a slightly different direction, I know I've seen a problem with applicants, CFI applicants, really being aware of their responsibilities, and this is certainly in the area of Operation 1, but their true responsibilities as instructors. And what I'm looking for, if I ask, what's your most important responsibility? What I'm looking to hear is to create a safe pilot. And sometimes they'll start talking about all the things that Shepherd Air told them to talk about. They never understand that they have to give the why of something. They're able to talk rote knowledge, what they've read in their prep material, and understand, well, why do you want to tell the learner that? And they're lost.
And another thing I try to stress with new instructor applicants is the fellow that gave me my initial instructor check ride made the point, and I've used it ever since, that the standards that you set and the performance that you demonstrate to your students is the best that they will ever do. So if you cut the corner here and cut the corner there and don't worry about this rule or whatever, then that's the standard your student sees, and that's what they will emulate in their own flying.
I personally think the initial CFI is probably the most important check ride of any of them. And if you put a bad instructor out there, you're going to put bad pilots out there. And we have enough of them out there now. We don't need to create any more. So that one, exactly what you're saying, Bill, those standards just have to be rock bottom. You can't give on that at all.
No.
And I've gotten kind of a reputation for that. I don't give any on that initial CFI. It's the most important test as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
When you have an initial CFI, then it's important that you really stick to the basics, the fundamentals. People talk about all sorts of gee whiz details and fancy things, but the fundamentals of aviation are what's leading to a lot of the accidents you hear about today, whether it's Lion Air and they're not flying the airplane properly, or whatever, Asiata crashing a 777 in San Francisco because they couldn't fly a visual approach. Basic fundamentals are so important. If you don't have that foundation, you're not going to go anywhere.
And another unfortunate thing, and I've said this before publicly to national audiences, we've got a lot of instructors who are only there because they want hours, and they're not interested in teaching. And I certainly see this in the instructor applicants to come to me. And one of the things I ask, why are you becoming an instructor? Are you becoming an instructor because you really want to teach? Because you recognize this is the most important job we have in aviation? And none of them are aware of that.
Right.
No, I need 1,500 hours.
That's right.
And then I'm done teaching.
That's right. Sure.
And how can we expect better when our system is set up this way?
I couldn't agree with that more. Sometimes that initial CFI, I'm not sure they've really got their head on straight. Are they really heading in the direction they should be heading?
Right.
I couldn't agree with you more on that.
I mean, I had a gentleman 2 weeks ago. He didn't have to do any of the FOI stuff because he teaches at a college nearby, and he actually teaches marketing. And the fella's in his 50s. Now he has that maturity, and he understands what teaching is about, and he wants to teach. His real reason, when I asked him, why do you want to become an instructor? And his answer, and I loved it, I want to become a better pilot.
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting.
And I am seeing some older folks who want to come into instructing, but their problem is so often that they're already an established professional of some kind, and they have assets. And they're worried about their assets.
Oh, sure. That's right.
Because they could kiss their assets goodbye. But I'm serious. There are some folks that are not young kids and know how to communicate, know what's important, and how to teach, know how to
standards.
And set standards. Yes. But with these young kids who are just looking to race through it, and they're using products like, Shepherd Air, and just come in with rote knowledge. And my question is, how do we fight that? And that's really something that SAFE's trying to do. And our whole, we don't see it here, the CFI Proficiency Project that we're going to launch in the fall at AOPA. And it's exactly for those reasons.
Right. No, I think that's why I've supported SAFE, for so long, because I think the instructor is the foundation of the whole aviation community, and as we've talked about, we see all sorts of issues with flight instructor capabilities and skills and motivations and all that, and just improving the level of professionalism in the flight instructor community is something that will help us all in the long run.
And I think kind of summation to what both of you are saying is the guy that's trying to get by with the bare minimum. What can I do to squeak by and get this rating? And I don't have much tolerance for that. We can't allow that kind of person to go out there and start molding pilots.
I monitor a couple of these forums, and you see that mentality all the time on these CFI forums, not general pilot, but just specifically for CFI. And they're always looking for shortcuts. What's the easy way of doing this? What's the fast way of doing this? And it's, we're the only country where any one of us could issue an applicant a CFI rating, and they can go out the next day and teach someone and sign their recommendation for a practical test. You can't do that in Canada, you can't do that in England, you can't do that in Australia, you can't do that in France. But try to tell the FAA to make a regulatory change?
We'll stay away from that subject.
Okay. What do you see? I see problems where we certainly have to cover endorsements. And I'd like to think that a CFI applicant is going to be able to rattle right off, because it's really showing they have a sense of their syllabus. What are the endorsements you'll have to give a private pilot? And I'm always asked, well, can I refer to 6165 hotel? I said, well, you could if you wanted the proper verbiage. I do. But don't you know the endorsements that you're going to have to give in the process from I want to be a pilot to you're ready to take your practical test? Am I wrong to think that they really should know these?
They should know the general requirements, but a lot of times people will pull out the advisory circular with all the endorsements. But one thing I caution them on is that a lot of those endorsements may not be up to date because the advisory circular isn't updated And I always tell them, when you're signing something off, go back to that 61, whatever it is, reg, and read what the
61,
verbiage
65,
is, and make sure that, depending on what it is you're signing off, that you make sure the wording is there. And then just like a 90-day solo endorsement, it says certain things. Well, have you really done that? Well, I flew with him 2 weeks ago, so I think he's okay, and I'll sign it off. But wait a minute, what are you signing? What does it really say?
Go ahead.
Let me add a point here that I think is very appropriate. SAFE has an app, and it's available to anybody. You don't have to be a member. 6165H or whatever the current one is in that app. I have that on my cell phone. I have it on my iPad. Has the correct wording, and it also has a hot link to the applicable federal aviation regulation that applies to that endorsement. So if you need to go deeper, as Bill said, and very rightly, you should go deeper. It's all at your fingertips, and that's one of the services that SAFE provides to basically the flight instructors, but it's available to anybody.
Excellent point, Mike. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. I noticed it, and this is something that happened to me recently, and it's something so I covered with the CFI applicant in recommending someone for a practical test. And I kind of covered that a little bit in depth because I had a commercial applicant come and failed miserably. And I spoke with his recommending instructor, and the instructor said, well, I tried to tell him he wasn't ready, but he told me he was sure he was, so I signed him off because I knew he would not pass.
Don't you love that?
And I am thinking to myself, and in fact, I discussed this with Jeff Edwards. Jeff calls me all the time when he has to moan about problems that we have in aviation. And Jeff said, technically, if I wanted to press charges against that instructor, I could press him for fraud.
Right, sure.
If you sign a recommendation saying this applicant is ready to take the practical test, and they're not, and you know it, and you're signing it only because you'll let the examiner say they're not ready, they have no business being a flight instructor.
Well, I think some flight schools are maybe working under a guaranteed program pricing or something along those lines, or somebody's anxious to move on to the next thing or whatever it is, or they're only going to be there for 2 weeks and they got to finish things up. So I've had very frustrating, as you both know, but sometimes an instructor will have the same attitude, and they'll say, well, I've tried it, let's see if you're having a good day. I'll sign you off for a check ride. Go take the check ride and maybe it'll work.
Let's try it and see if he can pass. So how many times have I heard that?
So then we become the bad guys because, well, we just told him what he already knew.
Mm-hmm.
And, but that's the way it happens sometimes. Ain't it fun?
Well, and I think there's another real basic problem in the flight instructor community is, have they trained them against the standards, and are they ready? Or are we going to try this and see if we can get by the examiner? Sure. There again is that minimum that I was just talking about earlier. And unfortunately, it's too much of that out there. There's more than we should not be seeing that.
No, we
but
shouldn't.
we are.
No, we shouldn't. Yeah, it's interesting, and I just had this thought actually. You look at Cirrus, okay, and you look at the training that they give anyone who buys an airplane now.
I'm a Cirrus instructor.
So you know this training is completely standardized. This is the way it shall be taught. And look what it has done to the accident rate in Cirrus. It's brought it way, 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 way down.
It's below the national standard.
It's probably one of the safer planes to fly now because of standardized training.
Right.
And yet we do not have that within the industry, within the FAA. I hate to say it.
Well, Cirrus is now doing that when you buy a used aircraft. They call it their Embark program.
Exactly.
And they will give you 3 full days of paid training toward the transition training. And there's a basic transition for VFR, advanced transition for IFR rated students, pilots, not students. So,
but the instructors can't be, well, yeah, I'll do it my way. Yeah, that's what Cirrus says, but I'll do it my way. No.
If you want to get paid, you have to
this
follow
is
that.
The standard, and that's what
exactly
you have
right.
to do. And if you don't like it, there's the door.
Well, if you're dealing with a freelance Part 61 instructor, the only standard he has is what he has to meet when he comes to one of us to take a check ride. There's no standardization along the way at all.
Exactly.
So it's we're kind of the last standardization review before you let them loose, so to speak.
The last turn on the,
That's right.
on the path.
That's right. So you always have to keep that in your back of your mind. I think.
Right.
And you know, if you, all three of us have done this for quite a few years, you typically will recognize that guy walking through the door, or you know the instructor, and you know, well, here's going to be one of those days. Unfortunately, it's easy to recognize, I guess.
Some you look forward to, and some you don't.
Exactly.
Very true.
I have instructors that I just welcome their check rides because I know they're guys. I had a flight instructor candidate. There's 2 knowledge tests, and I noticed he had 100 on both tests. One was his second try, and I said, "What happened?" He said, "I got a 98 the first time, and I took it again to get 100." Now there's somebody that cares.
Wow.
There's somebody that's quality.
Oh my gosh.
And he's being driven by a top-notch instructor. He's got standards that have been set for him. He's following them. And, you know, those are the kind of guys we like to test. I enjoyed that test, and it was initial CFI. Enjoyed every minute of it. Took all day.
Do you think 141 school adds standardization to the program on a general
They
basis?
should. But
They should, not necessarily. And I won't tell any stories now, especially because it could get out there, and I don't want to embarrass any schools.
But it's better than just the guy that does occasional instructing under Part 61, perhaps.
For what we'll call the shade tree instructor.
141, they have a training course outline that's been approved by the FAA, and they should be following that. It's lesson 1, you do this, lesson 2, you all know what it is. And if they're following that, it should be standardized. Now, some instructors follow it, and some don't. That's just like anything in life. We have people that work within the boundaries and people that don't. And unfortunately, that's what we're looking at.
And I know there are good schools and bad schools. There's some 141 schools with examining authority, and then someone will come to me after a couple of ratings through that school because that school doesn't have examining authority for the commercial. And it's, really?
I've done the same thing.
Really?
I've seen the same thing.
Yeah. So, yeah, there is the standard. But I will say, and it's kind of pat and safe on the back in 2011, our pilot training reform symposium was first efforts within industry, and SAFE was the leader in this, to try to improve the standards by which every pilot is trained. But it was called the Pilot Training Reform Symposium. And that was reforming the instructors.
Sure.
And SAFE is continuing this now with this CFI proficiency project.
And I think the mentoring program is another valuable resource. If you're dealing in a situation where you have a 141 school with a chief instructor, a lot of times the chief instructor will take a new instructor under their wing and kind of help them get it, learn the ropes of instructing and all the details of day-to-day flight instructing. But I think the SAFE mentoring program is a good opportunity. I've been working with one fellow who's working, as a Part 61 instructor, and every once in a while he'll give me a call and ask about, one thing or another, and it's good to be able to kind of help them learn the ropes.
I remember when we started the program, and you were one of the first mentors to sign up. But are mentees knocking at your door? No. You might have one or two that are really great.
That was SAFE's first program, and it was in reaction to our members. That was their request. We wanted a mentoring program. And I have referred some brand new instructors to that, and they've really appreciated it. Almost all of the senior instructors have run into the situation they've run into. What do I do? And he said, well, I had it, and here's what happened, and here's my suggestion. And that's an excellent program. You know it probably better than I do. You've got more experience in it.
I think if an instructor takes their job seriously and brings some integrity to it, we wouldn't have the problems. And it's okay if you want to teach to get 1,500 hours. That's okay. That's kind of the pipeline, the way it's been forever and a day. But while you're doing it, bring integrity to it and do your best.
Well, that's a big thing.
Rather than the shortcuts.
Yeah, the integrity and just doing it well. I think any professional pilot should do fundamental flight instruction for a period of time, because you learn so much when you get to the level of understanding that you can teach it. And that is, that's a level of understanding that will stick with them through the rest of their flying career. Even if they're going to go fly with an airline or whatever, those fundamentals that they taught for a couple of years, if they do it well and they really work at it and know what they're talking about, they're going to be very important throughout their flying careers. So My opinion is everyone should be required to do that, but that it's not going to happen. But another thing is when an instructor gets it as an initial certificate, perhaps there should be a program that requires them to work under the guidance of another instructor, something like that.
This is what they do in Canada, in England, Australia, much of Europe. I think it would be great if the agency actually mandated that.
Sure.
But I don't think the economics will allow that.
Not likely to happen, but I think it would be a great idea.
Be a good goal. See if we could get that out there and get somebody to start listening to it.
That's right.
And that's what people like the three of us are here to do.
Sure.
Yep.
That's right.